Somewhere in a museum drawer, sitting in a box that almost nobody opened for years, there was a bone so small that scientists assumed it belonged to something unimportant. A lizard, maybe. A juvenile of some forgettable species. Nobody looked twice. And then somebody finally did look twice. And what they found inside that tiny, overlooked fragment has quietly rewritten one of the most famous stories in the history of life on Earth. Because that bone did not belong to a lizard. It belonged to a baby Tyrannosaurus rex, a hatchling. Something the size of a house cat with teeth already worn down from biting into bone. And that single discovery is only the beginning of what you are about to hear. Because in the last few months, an avalanche of new evidence has landed on the desks of paleontologists around the world, and every single piece of it is forcing scientists to tear up what they thought they knew about the most famous predator that ever lived. This is not a story about dusty old bones sitting quietly in glass cases. This is a story about an animal whose true nature has been hiding from us for over a century. And it is only now, with new tools, new technology, and new fossils pulled from the ground in just the last year, that the real Tyrannosaurus rex is finally starting to reveal itself. And I promise you, the creature that is emerging from this new evidence is stranger, more dangerous, and more astonishing than the one you grew up learning about. Let's start with the part of this story that changes everything about how long a Tyrannosaurus rex actually lived, and how it grew into the 8-ton killing machine that ruled the end of the age of dinosaurs. For decades, the standard answer among paleontologists was that Tyrannosaurus rex hit its full adult size somewhere around the age of 25. That number came from counting growth rings inside fossilized leg bones, the same basic principle as counting rings in a tree stump. Every year of an animal's life leaves behind a faint line of new bone, and if you slice a fossil thin enough and study it under the right light, you can count backward through the animal's entire biography. For a long time, 25 years was treated as settled science. Then, a team of researchers, led by a professor of anatomy working with 2 other leading paleontologists, decided to revisit that number using something previous studies simply did not have access to. They examined bone samples from 17 different Tyrannosaur specimens, by far the largest data set ever assembled for this kind of analysis, and instead of relying only on ordinary light, they used circularly polarized and cross-polarized lighting techniques that reveal a category of growth ring nobody had been counting before. What they found rewired the entire growth timeline of the animal. Tyrannosaurus rex did not finish growing at 25. It kept growing for roughly 40 years, a full 15 years longer than scientists had assumed for decades. Picture that for a moment. An apex predator weighing close to 8 tons, continuing to pack on size and mass for 4 full decades, longer than most human careers, longer than some marriages. That is not a minor correction to a textbook footnote. That is a fundamental rewrite of how we understand the biology of the most famous animal in prehistory. But the story gets stranger because buried inside that same growth data was something that has paleontologists quietly buzzing behind the scenes. When the researchers compared the growth curves of individual specimens, 2 of the most famous Tyrannosaurus fossils ever discovered, nicknamed Jane and Petey, did not match the growth pattern of the others. Statistically, their growth trajectories stood apart from the rest of the group in a way that cannot be explained as ordinary individual variation. Now, growth records alone cannot prove that Jane and Petey belong to an entirely different species. Science is careful that way, and rightly so. But the researchers themselves have said the evidence raises a genuinely intriguing possibility, one that connects directly to a controversy that has been quietly dividing the paleontology world for years. Because there is a faction of scientists who believe that some of the smaller fossils we have been calling juvenile Tyrannosaurus rex are not juveniles at all. They believe those fossils belong to a completely separate, smaller species of Tyrannosaur that has been hiding in plain sight inside museum collections for 100 years, mislabeled the entire time. The proposed species has a name, Nanotyrannus, and if it turns out to be real, it means that for over a century, paleontologists, studying what they believed were baby versions of the king of the dinosaurs were, in some cases, actually studying fully grown adults of an entirely different, smaller predator that lived alongside Tyrannosaurus rex in the same forests, hunting the same prey, in the same shadow of the same apex killer. This debate is still unresolved. It is one of the most heated arguments happening in paleontology right now, and this new growth study did not settle it. If anything, it poured gasoline on it. Now let's talk about the discovery that, for me, is the single most jaw-dropping piece of this entire story, because it takes everything we just discussed about growth and slams it against the opposite end of the Tyrannosaurus life cycle. If adult Tyrannosaurus rex took 40 years to reach full size, what did this animal look like on the very first day of its life? For years, the honest answer was that nobody really knew, because baby dinosaur fossils, especially from giant predators, are almost impossibly rare. Small, fragile bones simply do not survive the fossilization process the way massive thigh bones do. They get crushed, scattered, weathered away, or overlooked entirely by researchers trained to search for the big, dramatic finds. But a team of researchers went back through museum collections, specifically hunting for isolated, easily dismissed bone fragments, the kind of material most paleontologists walk right past. And tucked inside that overlooked material, they identified something remarkable. A tiny fossilized foot bone, a metatarsal, so small that at first glance it seemed to belong to nothing significant at all. When they compared it against other fossils from the same time period, only one explanation fit every characteristic they were seeing. It was the foot bone of an actual Tyrannosaurus rex, and it was almost certainly the smallest one ever found. This wasn't an isolated fluke either. Once the team knew what they were looking for, they went back and re-examined other small bones and teeth in collections around the world and realized that many of them could also be attributed to newly hatched tyrannosaurs, animals that had barely broken out of their eggs. What they discovered about these hatchlings is genuinely unsettling in the best possible way. These baby Tyrannosaurus rex were small enough to be compared, quite literally, to a modern house cat. Picture the deadliest land predator in the history of the planet starting life smaller than something that might curl up on your couch. And yet, the researchers found something that should send a chill down your spine. Even at the tiny hatchling size, the proportions of the foot bone already echoed the exact build of a full-grown adult, just narrower relative to its length. The teeth recovered alongside these tiny remains were already chunky, already worn down from use, exactly like the teeth of a massive adult grinding through bone. In other words, these were not soft, helpless newborns easing gently into life. These were miniature killing machines from nearly the moment they hatched, already biting into solid bone the same way their 10-ton parents tore apart triceratops on the plains of prehistoric North America. Researchers involved in the discovery have openly admitted their own surprise at just how closely these hatchling fossils resembled adults in form, and they have pointed to a deeper, uncomfortable truth about paleontology itself. For generations, scientists studying dinosaurs have gravitated toward the big, dramatic, headline-grabbing skeletons, the complete skulls, the towering thigh bones, the specimens that fill a museum hall. The small, fragmented, easily explained-away bones get shoved into drawers and forgotten, not because they are unimportant, but because they are hard to study and nobody expected them to hold answers this significant. This discovery is a direct warning that an entire hidden chapter of Tyrannosaurus rex's life, its earliest and most vulnerable days, may have been sitting quietly in storage rooms the whole time, waiting for someone patient enough to look. And there is something else buried in that same research that deserves your full attention, because it reshapes the picture of Tyrannosaurus rex reproduction itself. The evidence increasingly suggests that these animals were not raising a single precious offspring at a time. The pattern of small bones and teeth recovered points toward broods, multiple hatchlings entering the world together, potentially numbering close to a dozen at once. Try to hold that image in your mind. Not one apex predator emerging cautiously into a hostile world, but an entire litter of them, already armed with bone-crushing teeth, already built like miniature versions of the deadliest hunter of their era, all hatching out together and competing immediately for survival in a landscape crawling with other predators, eager to eat something that small. The ecological implications of that alone are staggering. It means the forests and floodplains of the late Cretaceous, the final act of the age of dinosaurs, were periodically flooded with waves of newly hatched tyrannosaurs, tiny but lethal, working their way up through decades of growth toward the terrifying adulthood we have always associated with the name Tyrannosaurus rex. Stop and think about what that means for the world these animals actually lived in, because it is easy to hear a fact like T-Rex hatchlings were the size of a cat, and let it slide past as a cute trivia detail. It is not a cute detail. It is a complete reworking of the food chain of the late Cretaceous. If broods of a dozen tiny tyrannosaurs were hatching out at once, then the vast majority of them almost certainly never survived to adulthood. Small, cat-sized predators, no matter how sharp their teeth, are still small. They would have been vulnerable to larger tyrannosaurs, to other mid-sized predators, to simple environmental disaster, to starvation. That means the landscape these animals inhabited was not just home to a fixed population of adult killers stalking around at the top of the food chain. It was also crawling, quietly and mostly invisibly to us until now, with waves of juvenile tyrannosaurs at every single stage of that 40-year growth curve, from cat-sized hatchling to school bus-sized adult, each size class likely hunting different prey, competing for different resources and facing different threats. Paleontologists have a term for this kind of ecological pattern, where a single species effectively fills multiple ecological roles across its lifespan simply by growing so dramatically over time. It suggests that Tyrannosaurus rex, on its own, may have functioned as an entire ecosystem's worth of predators, cycling through different roles from birth to death, rather than a single static creature that simply appeared, fully formed, at the top of the food chain. Now let's go deeper into that Nanotyrannus controversy, because it deserves more than a passing mention, and it directly connects to everything we have just covered about growth and hatchlings. For more than a century, paleontologists have occasionally unearthed Tyrannosaur skeletons that were clearly smaller than a full-grown Tyrannosaurus rex, but that still displayed adult characteristics. Fused bones, mature proportions, features that did not look like an animal still in the middle of rapid growth. The traditional explanation was simple. These were teenage Tyrannosaurus rex, caught mid-growth, not yet finished packing on the size and bulk of a full adult. Case closed, or so it seemed for generations. But a growing number of researchers have pushed back hard against that explanation, arguing that some of these smaller skeletons show features that are simply incompatible with them being younger versions of Tyrannosaurus rex at all. Narrower skulls, proportionally longer legs built for speed rather than raw power, and forelimbs that are proportionally longer and more developed than anything seen in adult Tyrannosaurus rex. Their argument is that these are not awkward teenage phases of the king of the dinosaurs. They are fully grown adults of a completely separate, smaller species that has been hiding under the wrong name in museum collections for generations. A lean, fast, forest-adapted hunter that lived in the shadow of Tyrannosaurus rex, the same way a wolf might live in the shadow of a bear. Similar habitat, similar general shape, but a fundamentally different animal built for a different kind of hunting. This debate has real, high-profile fossils sitting directly at the center of it, and the newest large-scale growth study did nothing to resolve the argument cleanly. In fact, by identifying specific specimens whose growth curves statistically refuse to match the rest of the Tyrannosaurus rex dataset, it may have quietly strengthened the case for the skeptics. If those individual fossils truly do not fit the same biological growth trajectory as confirmed Tyrannosaurus rex specimens, then labeling them as simply young T-Rex starts to look less like careful science and more like an assumption nobody had seriously challenged until now. This is precisely the situation paleontology finds itself in today. An unresolved argument backed by increasingly serious statistical evidence on both sides over whether an entire second predator species has been sitting in our museums in plain sight the whole time. Now let's move from the beginning of a Tyrannosaurus rex's life to something almost nobody expected scientists to ever recover at all. Direct physical evidence of what was happening inside this animal's body while it was still alive and healing from an injury. This part of the story centers on one of the most famous individual Tyrannosaurus rex specimens ever unearthed, a massive skeleton nicknamed Scotty. Scotty is already legendary among paleontologists for its sheer size, but the newest chapter of Scotty's story has nothing to do with size and everything to do with something almost invisible. Researchers were examining one of Scotty's ribs, a rib that had been fractured at some point during the animal's life and had begun the slow, painful process of healing before Scotty eventually died. Instead of relying on conventional imaging, the team turned to an extraordinarily powerful tool: synchrotron X-rays generated by a particle accelerator, technology capable of peering inside dense fossilized material with a level of precision that ordinary scanning simply cannot match, all without damaging or destroying the fossil in the process. What they found inside that ancient, healing rib was almost impossible to believe. A preserved network of what appears to be actual blood vessels, structures rich in iron, left behind by the biological healing process that was happening in Scotty's body 66 million years ago. This is not fossilized dinosaur DNA, and no legitimate researcher is claiming that it is. But it is something almost as remarkable: microscopic physical traces of the actual biological repair process this animal's body carried out after suffering a real injury, preserved across 66 million years of geological time. Somewhere in a fight, a fall, or some other violent encounter we will never fully reconstruct, Scotty broke a rib, and then Scotty's body did what living bodies do. It healed. And astonishingly, evidence of that healing survived long enough for 21st century scientists to shine a beam of accelerated particles through solid rock and rediscover it. This finding drags Tyrannosaurus rex out of the realm of a static, museum-mounted skeleton and directly into the realm of a living, breathing, suffering, healing animal, one that fought battles, sustained real wounds, and carried the physical scars of survival, exactly the way any living creature does. Think about what it actually took for that evidence to reach us. Scotty's rib broke sometime during an active, violent life, 66 million years before a single human being would ever walk the earth. The wound began to close, and then whatever caused Scotty's eventual death interrupted a healing process that was already underway. A process frozen in place at the exact moment of death, and then buried, compressed, mineralized, and locked inside solid rock for an almost incomprehensible stretch of time. For that evidence to survive intact, it required an extraordinarily rare sequence of geological luck. And for us to actually detect it required a piece of technology, the particle accelerator, that did not even exist until the tail end of the 20th century. In other words, this evidence was always there, sitting inside Scotty's skeleton the entire time it toured museums and appeared in documentaries, and stood as one of the most recognizable Tyrannosaurus rex specimens on the planet. Nobody could see it. Nobody had the tool. It took a synchrotron facility, a machine capable of accelerating particles to nearly the speed of light and firing them through solid stone, to finally expose a wound that this animal survived tens of millions of years before the first human ancestor ever stood upright. Now, let's dig into where this entire lineage may have actually come from, because the newest evidence on this front is quietly upending a geographic assumption that has stood for a very long time. For years, one popular theory held that the ancestors of Tyrannosaurus rex evolved somewhere in Asia, before eventually making their way across an ancient land connection into North America. But a fossil pulled from a bed in New Mexico is now putting serious pressure on that theory. Researchers studying a 74 million year old leg bone recovered from that site believe it may represent an early relative in the Tyrannosaurus rex lineage, and if that identification holds up, it adds real weight to an entirely different origin story, one where the lineage that eventually produced Tyrannosaurus rex actually took root in what is now the American Southwest, rather than arriving from somewhere else entirely. Even more significant than the location is the timing. This fossil suggests that the group of predators that would eventually give rise to Tyrannosaurus rex was already evolving toward gigantic size far earlier than paleontologists had previously believed. Instead of a relatively sudden late-stage transformation into the colossal apex predator we know, the evidence now points toward a longer, deeper, more gradual climb toward giant size, one that had already begun taking shape tens of millions of years before the Tyrannosaurus rex we picture in our minds ever existed. The origin of the world's most famous predator remains, in the words of researchers studying it, a genuine scientific mystery. But this new fossil is one of the most important clues uncovered in years, and it is forcing a serious reconsideration of exactly where and when the story of Tyrannosaurus rex truly begins. Take a step back now and look at everything this new evidence adds up to, because individually, each of these discoveries is remarkable. But together, they form something much bigger, an almost complete rewrite of the biography of Tyrannosaurus rex, from the moment of hatching to the moment of death. This is an animal that began life as something smaller than a house cat, one of possibly a dozen siblings hatching together, already equipped with bone-crushing teeth, before it had any size or strength to back them up. It then embarked on a growth process lasting roughly 4 full decades, a life history so extended that it forces us to imagine individual Tyrannosaurus rex living through enormous stretches of prehistoric time, growing larger and more dangerous with every passing year, potentially for longer than many human lifetimes of that era. Somewhere along that 4-decade journey, at least one individual, the one we call Scotty, sustained a genuine physical injury, a broken rib, and its body responded exactly the way any living creature's body does, by healing, leaving behind microscopic evidence that would improbably survive 66 million years, until modern science finally had the tools sensitive enough to detect it. And running underneath this entire narrative is a genuine unresolved controversy about whether some of the fossils we have confidently labeled as juvenile Tyrannosaurus rex for over 100 years actually belong to a completely different, smaller species entirely, a mystery predator hiding in plain sight in museum collections around the world, waiting for scientists to finally sort out the truth. None of this is speculation dressed up as fact. Every piece of this comes from published, peer-reviewed research, from real fossils pulled out of real rock in New Mexico, in Montana, and beyond, examined using real cutting-edge scientific instruments, from particle accelerators to advanced statistical growth modeling. And that is exactly what makes this moment in paleontology so exciting. Tyrannosaurus rex is, without question, the most extensively studied dinosaur in the history of science, examined by more researchers, described in more scientific papers, and depicted in more books and films than any other prehistoric animal that has ever lived. And yet, here we are, in this exact moment, watching scientists fundamentally revise how long this animal lived, how it grew, what it looked like as a newborn, how it may have healed from real injuries, and even where its ancestors truly came from. If an animal this famous, this thoroughly picked apart by more than a century of intense scientific scrutiny, can still produce discoveries this fundamental, discoveries that force us to throw out numbers and assumptions that stood unchallenged for decades, then it says something profound about how much prehistoric life still has left to teach us. The ground beneath our feet is still holding onto secrets from 66 million years ago, and it appears to be handing them over now, all at once, as though the fossil record itself decided this was finally the year to reveal what it had been hiding. So the next time you picture Tyrannosaurus rex, throw out the fixed, static image you grew up with, the fully grown 25-year-old adult standing frozen and finished in a museum hall. Replace it with something far more alive. Picture a creature hatching out alongside nearly a dozen siblings, already the size of a cat, already gripping bone with teeth worn from use. Picture that same animal, 40 years later, having weathered decades of growth, real injuries, and real healing, finally reaching the full 8-ton bone-crushing form that has terrified and fascinated us for over a century. And somewhere in the deep background of that entire story, picture an ancient ancestor, evolving toward gigantic size in the American Southwest tens of millions of years earlier than anyone suspected, quietly setting the whole story in motion. That is the real Tyrannosaurus rex the newest evidence is revealing to us. Not a finished monster frozen in time, but a living, growing, healing, mysterious animal whose full story is still, even now, 66 million years later, being written for the very first time.